Episode 37. What is the Mosaic Law? What is the law of Christ? What is meant by moral law? These are a few of the questions that will be addressed on this episode of Bible FAQ with Kirk Van. Hello, friends. Thank you for joining me again today. I'm Kirk Van Odeham, the host of Bible FAQ with Kirk Van, the podcast that provides brief, thoughtful, biblical answers to your questions. And I'm excited about recording this episode here today. I've been away from the podcast for a little bit and just looking very much forward to continuing on and adding to the many episodes that are already available for Bible FAQ with Kirk Van. And part of the reason it's been a little while is because I've been very busy with some other projects. The biggest of those projects may interest you if you are a fan of this podcast. If you enjoy the type of teaching and discussion that we have on Bible FAQ with Kirk Van, you will likely also enjoy a extended series that I've been doing on the topic on being Pentecostal. And basically, this is a summary and overview of the Pentecostal faith, and using as a launching pad a little booklet by David Bernard and Robin Johnston by the same name, On Being Pentecostal. So using some of those same topics to teach about the Pentecostal faith. And this is in three parts. The first part is our beliefs, such as the doctrine of revelation, the doctrine of the Bible, doctrine of God, doctrine of salvation. The second part is our practices, such as holiness, worship, gifts of the Spirit, and evangelism and missions. And part 3 is our stories, our Pentecostal history and heritage, and also a bit about experiencing Pentecost. And so, again, this is a multi-session series that I've been teaching for our own home church, River of Life. If you are interested in this, I think we just recorded either the 16th or 17th session this week. They can be found on a playlist on our church's Facebook page. So if you're interested in that, go to facebook.com/ROLMunsey/videos and scroll down to where you see playlists, and there will be a playlist there for On Being Pentecostal. And all of the episodes we have thus far are listed there. We have a couple more to go, so the total number will be about 18-ish, give or take, I think. So we have maybe another week or two to go before we close out that series. And I hope you avail yourself to checking that out, especially if you're interested in learning more about what it means to be Pentecostal and the Pentecostal faith. Well, I'm excited to get to the question I have for today. As you know, if you've listened to our podcast before, I like to answer questions that people submit to the podcast. To do that, there's 3 different ways you can do that. You can just simply email me a question at ask@kirkvan.com. You can go to our website, which is kirkvan.com. Click on the contact link at the top and then submit a question that way. Or you can go to the podcast Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Bible FAQ with Kirk Van, and you can submit a private message there on Facebook. Any way you'd like to do it, we'd love to hear your questions and try our best to provide some answers, at least discuss what the questions are. So without further ado, let me get to our questions for today. And I'm going to answer kind of a few questions, but they are all based on one question that was submitted from a listener of the podcast. And this listener's name is Victoria. She sent this question on Facebook Messenger, and she appears to be from the state of Texas. So thank you for contacting us from Texas. And let me read the question as written. It says here, "Hello, I was wondering if you could do a teaching on the difference between the law of Moses and the law of Christ, and how we are not under the law of Moses, but under the law of Christ. Could you also explain what is meant by the law of Moses and the law of Christ? Thank you, and Lord bless. Well, thank you, Victoria from Texas, on sending your question to the podcast, and I will be happy to do my best to try to answer this question. So the question revolves around the law of Moses and the law of Christ. And we'll get in a moment to a couple of the scriptures in the New Testament that this question likely stems from. So first, let me address the law of Moses, try to explain and describe what is meant by the law of Moses, or what sometimes we call the Mosaic Law. The Mosaic Law consists of all the commandments given to the Jewish nation of Israel through Moses. And Moses, of course, was God's appointed leader and prophet to the people at the time of the birth of Judaism. So Judaism as a religious system is usually accredited to being started by Moses. Now, of course, there were the patriarchs before Moses that worshipped the God of the Old Testament, but as a religious system is believed and often thought to be initiated by Moses as God directed him and through the giving of the law. So the Mosaic Law is contained in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which Moses wrote, all of these 5 books. Christians often call this the Pentateuch. The Jewish people generally call it the Torah or Torah. And these 5 books and the commandments contained therein are the foundation of the Jewish religion. So most are familiar with the 10 Commandments, as we call them. And what the 10 Commandments actually are a summary of the essence of the whole law. So it's kind of a preview of the rest of the law that follows. All the commandments of the Torah can trace back in some way, shape, or form to one of these 10 commandments. So according to the Jewish tradition, throughout the Torah, there's actually a grand total of 613 commandments contained there. If you were to try to isolate them into the smallest parts, there'd be 613 different commandments. Of course, there's other elements to each of these, and the Jewish people, as the religion grew and spread, they have written volumes and books on how to obey all these different commandments that are prescribed by Moses. So students of the Bible often differentiate between 3 different types or categories of the various commandments that are contained in the Mosaic Law. And these different types or categories, the first is civil law, or sometimes called governmental law, which dealt with the governing of Israel as a nation. So it was basically their constitution, if you will, on how to conduct themselves and to dispense justice and to solve disputes and all those types of things. So that would be the civil law. The second type or category of commandment in the Mosaic Law would be the ceremonial law, or sometimes called the ritual law. And these are specifically geared toward regulation of the sacrificial system of worship that God gave to Moses. So that was about the sacrifices and the other means through which they atone for their sins and worship the Lord their God. So those are more of the religious laws, if you will. And then the third type or classification of laws contained within, commandments contained within the Mosaic Law, are most generally called the moral law. And what these do is they reflect God's character and declarations of right and wrong, or good and evil. And so these things that would be called part of the moral law, the things that talk about what is right or wrong, good and evil, as such, these would actually transcend the moral law. In other words, they were spoken by God and delivered to the patriarchs even before God gave the law to Moses. There were certain principles that God established even before Moses came on the scene, the many generations through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And even before some of the patriarchs before them, God dealt with them and revealed his will to them. And so these reflections of God's character would be called the moral law. Sometimes we also call it natural law or divine law. Now, of course, these three classifications aren't explicitly delineated within the pages of the Old Testament itself. However, as I said, students of the Bible often differentiate these as an approach to analyzing and understanding the Mosaic Law. This is a good way to break it down, if you will, so we can comprehend what God is teaching and telling his people. So it's very important to note, despite what many people believe, the Mosaic Law was never intended by God to be fully observed by all people everywhere. Some people say the only way you can be saved is to obey every law in the Bible, including all of the Old Testament and the Mosaic Law. And not only is that not true for us today, it was never true in terms of what God's expectations were and what the understanding of the Jewish people were. The ancient Jews, long before the time of Christ, they believed that it was possible for non-Jews to be a part of what they referred to as the world to come if those non-Jews walked uprightly before the Lord in this life. Specifically, they believed that there were 7 principles that are binding on all mankind. And these are extrapolated in Genesis chapter 9 and sometimes known as the Noahide laws or the laws of Noah. And these are kind of the types of things that we can just know intuitively. Sometimes we call it general revelation, that it doesn't take a divine commandment from law, but just the matters of conscience that God deals to all human beings. And so as they're delineated in Genesis chapter 9 and popularly understood by the Jewish people in ancient Judaism, these 7 principles would be prohibition against blasphemy, prohibition against idolatry, against sexual immorality, against murder, against theft, and against cruelty of various kinds. And then the 7th is not a prohibition, but a positive injunction for a just society, things like establishing court and government that establishes and enforces social order. So the Jews believed if Gentiles would live by these things, they didn't have to convert to a Jew to be accepted into the world to come. And so from that perspective, it was never believed that a Jew or that any individual, I should say, all individuals had to abide by all of the Mosaic Law in order to be accepted by God to some degree. So that's a bit about the Mosaic Law. And I know that's very quick and rough, but that's a general overview, a general explanation. Now, what is meant by the law of Christ? Well, this phrase, this expression, law of Christ, is mentioned twice by name in the New Testament. The first would be in Galatians 6:2, and it says, "Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." Again, not much explanation there as to what that is. In 1 Corinthians 9:20 and 21, we're given a bit more information to go on. And this passage reads, "To the Jew," this is Paul speaking, "to the Jews I became like a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law, like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those under the law." And then verse 21, "To those who were without the law, like one without the law, though I am not without God's law, but under the law of Christ, to win those without the law." So the exact definition and meaning precisely is not given here to what is meant by the law of Christ, but we can certainly ascertain what is intended and what is meant here through the historical and theological context of this verse and the whole of the New Testament. Now, there are traditionally 2 primary ways of understanding and explaining what is meant by the phrase or designation law of Christ. And they're both very connected to one another. So let me explain both of these views or both of these explanations and then talk a little bit more about it. One view on how we can understand what the law of Christ means is some believe that this is a reference to the supreme commandment to love, as extolled by Jesus and reiterated throughout the rest of the New Testament. As such, the law of Christ would be reflected in several of the teachings of Jesus. First and foremost would be what's often called the Great Commandment. Let me read you a couple of examples about this. First, Mark 12, beginning with verse 28. And one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together, perceived that he had answered them well, asked him, which is the first commandment of all? And Jesus answered, the first commandment is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. And the second is like, namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is none other commandment greater than these. Matthew 22, verse 40, has a similar explanation, followed by this statement of Jesus. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. So what Jesus obviously meant by all the law and prophets, the law would be referring to the Mosaic law as recorded in those 5 books of Moses at the beginning of the Old Testament. The prophets would be all the other Old Testament writers, and that's what the Jews called their Bible. We call it the Old Testament. They called it the Tanakh. And the Tanakh means the law and the writings, or sometimes phrased the law and the prophets. So what Jesus is saying here is the entirety of the Old Testament, all the scripture that was recognized by the Jews, if you were to boil it all down, it really hangs on these 2 principles. Love God first and foremost, and love others, your neighbor, as yourself. Of course, this is very closely related to what we call the Golden Rule, which is really just a retelling of the Great Commandment. It's found in Matthew 7 and 12. Therefore, all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Sometimes this is paraphrased as saying, do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. And again, this is just kind of a rephrasing of the law to love others as Christ commanded us. So additionally, we can see the law the law of Christ reflected in the new commandment, as it's called, in John 3 and 15. And again, this all centers around the principle of love. Let me read you several verses of scripture here very quickly so you can get what I'm saying here. John 13:34, new commandment I have given you, that ye love one another as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another. John 15:12, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. John 15:17, these things I command you, that you love one another. And there are more verses in John chapters 13 through 15 that refer to the same principle. Those are the ones that are stated most clearly. So given the Great Commandment and the Golden Rule, the rephrasing of the Great Commandment, and this new commandment, as it's sometimes called in John 3 and 15, many have concluded that the law of Christ is this commandment to love. That's the law of Christ. Now, obviously, these are all centered on the same principle, and that's the principle of love. Love of God first, also reflected in the love of others. But there are several other New Testament verses that also point to this conclusion, if you will. Verses written by Paul, some written by Peter, some written by James, some written by John. And I want to read these quickly so we can kind of see what we mean. It seems as though they're all pointing to this as some kind of special teaching or central commandment that kind of encapsulates the essence of Jesus' teaching. For example, Romans 13:8, owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. Romans 13:10, love worketh no ill to his neighbor, Therefore, love is fulfilling the law. Galatians 5:13 through 14. But brothers, ye have been called unto liberty, only use not liberty as occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. 1 Thessalonians 4:9. But as touching brotherly love, ye need not that I write unto you, for you yourselves are taught of God to love one another. James 2:5. If you fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, you do well. 1 Peter 1:22. Seeing you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit unto unfeigned love of the brethren, see that you love one another with a pure heart fervently. 1 John 3:11. This is the message that ye have received, that you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. And finally, 1 John 3:23. And this is his commandment, that we should that we should believe on the name of the Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another as he gave us commandment. So as you can see, this commandment to love, and particularly to love one another or to love our neighbor as ourselves, this is reiterated throughout the New Testament, and it's always referred to or as a commandment or as fulfilling the law. And so many have concluded that since this is the essence and the central message of Jesus' teaching, this idea of loving God and loving others, that is in fact synonymous with or tantamount to the law of Christ. So the law of Christ is the law of love, some would say. Now, it's important to note here, when we talk about love and talk about Jesus' teaching on love, some people think, well, if you just treat people nice, then that's fulfilling Jesus' commandment, and that's all he expects, and that's all we need to do. And, you kind of get where I'm going with that. I don't have time to go into it further. But what I want to say is, just like faith, love is not merely an attitude or a mindset. It is that, and it is a commitment. It's an obligation. It's all of those things. But also, the love that the Bible describes reveals or manifests itself through our actions and our activities and our behavior, or as James said, through our works. So in one sense, we are obeying Christ's commandment to love by manifesting or showing or expressing love to God and others. But we should note, love is not an end to itself. It's our primary motivation for serving God and for serving others. But the scripture also teaches that we are demonstrating and revealing that we have the love of God and that we do love Christ, not merely by trying to show people how much we love him in these acts. That's all important, and that's all well and good, and that's all a part of it. But specifically, the New Testament teaches that we are demonstrating the love of Christ by obeying all of his commandments and keeping all of his commandments. And that is all the principles that he taught, both directly in his ministry in the Gospels, as recorded in the Gospels, and also throughout the Old Testament as Christ inspired the New Testament writers to write. And so this too is reiterated throughout the New Testament, and mostly by the Apostle John. For example, in the Gospel of John 14 and 15, Jesus says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." In verse 21 of the same chapter, "He that hath my commandments and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me." John 15 and 10, "If you keep my commandments, ye shall abide in my love." John 15 and 14, "You are my friends if you do whatsoever I command you." And then a couple of times in John's epistles, 1 John 5 and 2, By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep his commandments. And 1 John 5:3, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous or grievous. So what I'm trying to say here is love for God and loving God, and as it says here in John, also loving others, is inextricably linked and inseparably bound with keeping all of the commandments of Jesus Christ as reflected in the New Testament. And so love in practice and in conduct, not love in word only, and not the least of which is obedience to all the teachings of Jesus and the church that he established. So in one sense, the first part of this answer to what is the law of Christ, some believe it's synonymous with this divine commandment to love God, to love others, and by extension, we show that we love God and love others when we obey the commandments of Jesus as expressed in his ministry and throughout the New Testament. So yeah, love is just not just, it is expressions of helping people and that sort of thing, but you can help people and not obey the commandments of Jesus, or you can help people and obey the commandments of Jesus, and both are situated under this divine command to love God and to love others. So that's one way of looking at the law of Christ. A second way, and a related way, to view Paul's use of the phrase to view Paul's use of the phrase the law of Christ is by contrasting the law of Moses and the law of Christ together. So basically, this is differentiating between the old covenant and the new covenant. So in other words, in this way, the law of Christ is just another way of saying the New Testament or the new covenant. And this seems to be the point of 1 Corinthians 9 that we already read. Let me reiterate and read that again. To the Jews I became a Jew to win Jews, to those under the law like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those under the law. Verse 21, to those who are without the law like one without the law, though I am not without God's law, but under the law of Christ, to win those without the law. So Paul says here, first, he says, I'm not under the law. That is, he is saying, I'm not under the Mosaic law of the Jews. That's not binding on me. I'm not obligated to fulfill all of that in my life, because as a follower of Jesus Christ, that has been fulfilled. He clarifies then that he says, though I am not without God's law, but under the law of Christ. So I'm not under the Mosaic law, but I'm not without any law, and I'm not without God's law. I am under the law of Christ. So Paul contrasts himself both with those who were under the law, the Jews, and also from those who are without the law, the Gentiles or pagans. He said, I'm not exactly like either one of those. I'm not under the Mosaic law, but I'm also not without the law altogether. I am under the law of Christ. So it's clear here that Paul is making a distinction between the Mosaic law, aka the Old Testament law, and God's law, also known as divine law, which is reflected and confirmed in the New Testament or the New Covenant, which Paul here calls the law of Christ. To be clear, in this way, the law of Christ would be synonymous with divine law or natural law, or what's generally called moral law, which is the basis and the foundation of the entire New Testament. So in this sense, the law of Christ would be synonymous with the New Testament, synonymous with the New Covenant, if you will. And there are several verses pertaining to this in Hebrews, for example, and a few in some of Paul's writings that we don't have time to get into. But in this understanding, the law of Christ would include all of the principles and commands and doctrines that Jesus taught during his earthly ministry, to be sure. All of those principles and doctrines that he inspired his followers to expound and explain and unpack through the writings of the New Testament. And these are also a confirmation and a reiteration of the divine law or the natural law or the moral law, God's law that is expected by all people everywhere, the patriarchs, even Gentiles, as we discussed in Old Testament times. And so those are, since they're binding on everyone in God's economy, they're binding on Christians as well. So that's the second way to view this. One is the law of Christ means the divine commandment to love. The second one is the law of Christ means the New Testament in general, which is a confirmation, reiteration of natural law or divine law. And I personally do not see these views in conflict. Rather, I think that they can be reconciled. In other words, I think it's kind of two different ways of saying the same thing. So what I mean by this is we can accurately say that the law of Christ is the eternal, divine, natural, moral law for all humanity. They are sort of the same thing. It is also reflected in the entirety of the New Testament. It was revealed once and for all through the life and ministry of Jesus. It was put into effect by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and it is further unpacked and explained by the apostles and New Testament writers. So we can have that understanding of what the law of Christ is, but at the same time, we understand along with that love is the underlying foundation and motivation for obedience to God and his divine law and of the new covenant. For example, love for God is the first and great commandment, and loving others is the second great commandment. And on these hang all the law and the prophets, the entire Old Testament. And this supreme commandment to love is the necessary and primary factor for comprehending and interpreting and living everything necessary to fulfill God's divine law, and eternally revealed in the entire New Testament. So in other words, that's how we measure and evaluate if we really love God, by keeping his commandments, as we already read, but it also serves as the motivation. So under the Old Testament, individuals just sort of, people just, if they checked all the boxes, if they did all the right things, if they obeyed the law, then they were thought to be righteous. Jesus pointed out the hypocrisy of that, because people were living unrighteous lives in many ways, but they weren't contradicting or conflicting with the law of Moses in any way. But as Jesus said, they had not observed the weightier matters of the law. They were in violation of God's divine law in many ways, even though they were checking all the boxes. So Jesus is saying, and what this is, the way that we reconcile these and the way that they combine them and blend them in one unified idea is that the only way that we can truly fulfill God's divine law is by doing so through love. Not just say that we love, not just act like we love, but that's got to be the underlying motivation, and that has to be the way that we evaluate our lives. But in so doing, if we truly love God, then we will automatically seek to live a life that is pleasing to God in every way, that is pleasing to God and reflects the divine commandments, the moral law that he has established from the beginning of time, that he has revealed to human beings prior to the patriarchs, during the patriarchal period, even during the Mosaic law, and that Jesus reiterated and extolled and expanded and described so beautifully in his ministry, and inspired the New Testament writers to further clarify And so I think it's both and. I think the law of Christ is both synonymous with the New Testament and obeying its teachings and its message. But in so doing, we must be motivated by love and evaluate our progress and our fulfillment of the law through the love that we have and that we show. Well, there's many other things I could say on this topic, and I have many more notes here that I've compiled that are on this topic, and we'll revisit some of those points in upcoming episodes. So let me just give a quick summary here before we sign off on this particular question. So in summary, the law of Moses is the compilation of the 613 laws contained within the Torah and the religious system of Judaism that evolved from this. It's reflected in God's eternal divine moral law, but also, in addition to that, added other aspects for a limited time and purpose, such as ceremonial and civil law. And since those weren't permanent in nature, those are no longer binding upon us. There's more you could say about that, but we'll move on. So the law of Moses was given by God to Moses expressly and exclusively for the nation of Israel. And as a comprehensive system, the Mosaic law was never expected or required to be obeyed by all people everywhere, but by the Jewish people for the Jewish nation. As a comprehensive system. Now, that doesn't mean every aspect and every principle contained within the Old Testament is unnecessary for people both before and after the Old Testament or the time of the nation of Israel, because those moral commandments still hold. The law of Christ is the essence and teaching of New Testament doctrine. These teachings were introduced by Jesus as recorded in the Gospels and expounded and explained by the inspired writers of the New Testament. It also reflects and upholds, the law of Christ reflects and upholds God's eternal divine moral law, while shedding itself of the ineffectual Mosaic practices that only brought bondage with no power to resist sin. The foundation of the law of Christ is the supreme commandment to love God and love others. Love is our motivation for obedience. It is this love for and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ that inspires us and compels us as believers to know Him intimately, that we may obey God's divine law and righteously serve Him. So I hope that answers the question. I know I got into some things. I probably raised some questions that we don't have time to answer. It is, when you think on the finer points and details of a question like this, you can really go down a lot of dirt roads, but I tried to stick to the topic here and answer this question. So Victoria and all others interested in this question, I hope this brings some clarity and helps us to understand the difference between the law of Moses and the law of Christ. Well, please, all who enjoyed this podcast, send me some questions for future episodes. I'll look at those. I have a list already that I'm working my way through, and many of you have the same questions, so stay tuned for more future episodes. Well, that's all the time that we'll take for now. So until next time, the Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. Thank you again for listening. Farewell for now.